Well, it is such a joy to be in this space, reflecting on the many years that I have come to the conference or to fellowship gatherings. God has done some great work here, and I pray that that's true for all of us this morning. Well, a few years ago, when Joel presented my fellowship, the Augustine Fellowship, with the proposed new CPT mission statement, which, as you've heard, let's see, there we go, is forming Pastor Theologians to shepherd the church in our complex world. I shared in that meeting that I didn't love the infinitive to shepherd. Now, that's not to say I thought it should be a gerund or something. I was uncomfortable with the idea of shepherding itself. Yes, I am aware it's in the Bible. But Scripture offers many other images for what pastor theologians should do. We could be formed to serve the church or to care for the church. Shepherding seemed to me a little too top-down, like we were the ones in control, or even worse, it assumed that the members of our congregations were like sheep. And if you've ever heard any sermons at all, you've probably heard that sheep aren't that intelligent. The language set with me wrong, and though decent explanations were offered, I really could not get fully behind it. I have wondered if one reason for my hesitancy went all the way back to the birth of my ministry life. When I was ordained in 2016, my rector gave the homily. I had been at his parish at that point for 4 years, and so he had served as my primary mentor in my vocation. One naturally remembers such important moments, but even so, the opening line of his sermon left an indelible impression. "Welcome to your demotion," he said. "The higher one advances in ordained ministry," he explained, for instance, in our tradition, from deacon to priest, and then for some, to bishop or archbishop, "the deeper one advances in service. If to follow Jesus is to take up the towel, then ministers are not those who lord over, but those who kneel down." This seemed patently true to me. At that point, I was 36 years old, a mom to 3, a junior faculty member at a local Christian college. Almost all the members of my congregation were older, more established, more influential. The idea of shepherding them felt ridiculous, but serving them, that made great sense. I had the time and resources and passion to study Scripture, and so I could offer up those gifts humbly from the bottom to serve them, to equip them with a love for and understanding of God's Word, so that they could then go out into their well-established lives as more faithful disciples. I could offer those gifts to them, but to shepherd them, not so much. I'm speaking at this conference today, so you might have intuited that I've changed my opinion. And it wasn't just Joel's insightful argument and winsome personality that convinced me, although I do respect him a great deal. By virtue of another project, I spent some time in John 10, so it was actually Jesus who changed my mind. Through his teaching here, he affirmed that my inclinations for service were not completely off, but that they were not sufficient on their own. And I'll share with you today what I've learned. To John 10. John 10 is the most concentrated discussion of shepherding in the New Testament. Out of 31 references, John 10 has 5. Now, that may not sound like much, but the rest are scattered throughout, 1 or 2 references here or there. The next largest concentration, as you might imagine, is in Luke 2, when actual shepherds visit Jesus. So not only is John 10 the most dense, it also possesses the most potential for application. I'm noticing that my slides kind of all slot in at once, which is not the biggest idea, but it's not as super cool. So don't pay attention too far down the line, right? Just listen to what I'm saying. So not only is John 10 the most dense, it also offers the most potential for application. And this is true because this chapter is quite multidimensional. It is not just a shepherd and some sheep. There are multiple characters: human, mammalian, inanimate, good and bad. And I'll use this rubric of the various characters to reflect upon Jesus' presentation of shepherding. I'd like to begin with the villains. And I'll start with the one who seems to be the worst, the wolf. I should have cued the band to do the Peter and the Wolf theme right now, but I wasn't that far ahead. In verse 12, Jesus speaks of the approach of the wolf, a creature who comes to steal the sheep and scatters them. The picture Jesus paints is of a carnivore being true to its nature to consume creatures weaker than itself. It's not clear if the sheep are in the pen or in the pasture, but whatever the setting, the wolf destroys on both an individual and a communal layer. Sheep, or maybe just a few, maybe just one, are stolen. That's the word there, harpazo. Taken by an entity to whom the sheep do not belong, and so the sheep are taken with violence. The end result of this threat would be death for the sheep. But even the others who might not be taken in this act, they do not escape unscathed. They are scattered, driven away from their place of safety and respite by fear. They are dispersed from one another, the strength of numbers diffused to the weakness of singularity, exposing each of them more dangerously to the risk of being the next object of theft. It is a red and tooth and claw kind of image. None of us gathered here would consider the option of being wolves. And I'm not even fully convinced that Jesus wants his listeners to map this creature onto any human enemy. I recognize, of course, that Matthew 7:14 has Jesus warn of false prophets who, though they present as sheep, are in fact rapacious wolves. The word there for rapacious is the same word for stealing, present here in John 10. It would grieve me to hear if you have had experience with such people, those who intentionally misrepresent themselves simply to cause damage. I have not, and maybe that is a mercy. But my hunch is that most humans, unless they are sociopathic, believe that they are doing good even if they wreak havoc. I wonder if the mammalian villain in this parable is not meant to point to any human, but to the chief enemy of God, who tempts humans to fulfill the satanic destructive mission. In Matthew's version of the parable of the sower, it is the evil one who snatches harpazo, the sown seed. And then later, in this very chapter of John 10, Jesus promises 2 times over that no one will be able to snatch harpazo, those in his care, out of his hand, or that of his Father. Even when there are humans who function as wolves, they are being driven by the chief wolf. It is the job of the shepherd to protect the flock against not just flesh and blood, but even more, against powers and principalities. That necessary call on the shepherd leads by contrast to the next negative character, that of the hired worker. Yeah, that didn't work so well. All right. The hired worker, Jesus makes clear, is not the shepherd. This person does not consider the sheep as their own. He or she has no skin in the game. The person is simply present for the paycheck. And so when things get scary, when the wolf comes, when there is a threat to their bodily safety, the hired worker escapes, flees to protect self-interest, and in so doing abandons the sheep, leaving them exposed to the mortal danger of the wolf. I'm also confident that if you've chosen to come to this conference, you do not fit the description of a hired worker. You've said yes or are considering saying yes to the call to pastoral ministry or some form of ministerial leadership. You've made an investment of time and energy because you want to be equipped to endure well in that call. But I wonder if we should not dismiss the hired worker too quickly, if there might be a lesson or two from this character, even for those of us here. As was the case with the wolf, we could ask, if we are not the hired workers, do we know any around us? Because in the parable this is a person and not an animal, it seems to me likely that Jesus would invite us to consider such a question. Might we need to be attentive to the risk that those on the ministry team around us are in it for the wrong reasons? Now, doubtful they're in it for the money. For pastoral ministry, it's not known for being especially lucrative. Much more likely, they might be in it for the flexible schedule, the accolades, the cultural deference to the pastor. For even if that diminishes in wider society, it is preserved among those who come to church. The glory that Jason spoke of yesterday, power, temptation to lord over one's little fiefdom. As we learn to watch for these unhealthy features in the leaders around us, we can do the same for ourselves. When I was ordained, I worried about the correct motivation early at that point in my ministry. Not, as I've shared, did I struggle with a lust for power, but I was concerned about the possibility that I was in it for the achievement. I started asking questions about the priesthood just as I finished up my PhD. Did I simply need another big goal to accomplish? Another title to add to my CV? It's a healthy thing to ask such questions, I believe, and rarely will we conclude, I think, that we are free from any hint of self-interest. We look for the hired worker syndrome in our colleagues and in ourselves, not to immediately fire them or force ourselves to step down, but simply to root out those seeds of selfishness, to rightly align our flourishing with that of the sheep. And the criteria from John 10, it seems to me, is this. We do not ask, do I have any sense of self-fulfillment in my ministry life? And then, if so, conclude that I should feel guilty about that. No, for I firmly know that though this call may cost us everything, it is a source of deepest fulfillment and joy. Instead, the question is, are there ways in which I'm elevating my own fulfillment over the protection and needs of my congregation? Do I craft a sermon to dazzle or to disciple? Do I initiate pastoral care relationships because it feels good to be needed, or because I have, through the discernment of the Spirit, perceived that a particular person really is in need? Do I care enough about these people that when the going gets tough, I won't abandon them, but I will be willing to take a few knocks on their behalf? This last example, taking a few knocks on their behalf, it's really the primary force of this hired worker character in the metaphor, and it demands care. Jesus is not teaching us to obliterate ourselves for the sake of ministry. For it is a terrible thing for the sheep if the hired worker runs away, but it would also be a terrible thing for the sheep if the hired worker jumps in front of the wolf and demands that the wolf consume him or her instead. Through either abandonment or destruction of the hired worker, either way, the sheep are left exposed. No, the example teaches us that when the going gets tough and there are threats against the sheep, the right thing to do would be to scuffle with the wolf, maybe take a few scratches, but ultimately not be eliminated, but eliminate that destructive creature. I've had a pastor friend do this for me. There was a season in which, not just on the internet, but also in my own congregation, there were some false narratives spread about me. Maybe you've had that happen. In that season, you know that you can't really defend yourself because your word is suspect. And my husband is on staff at my church. He is the music director and organist. And he couldn't defend me because he is my husband. Anything he would have said would have been suspect because surely he would have been corrupted by my evil ways. We needed someone to step in on our behalf, and our pastor did. Very practically, met with some people for multiple hours, countered those lies with truth, got yelled at, had some people walk out of the church, but he was in a strong place. He was new, and so it wasn't personally involved in this issue, and so those scuffles did not destroy him. He could handle the attacks the wolf was orchestrating through these particular people. What he did for us was immense, but it only cost him a few scratches. That's what Jesus is asking of us. Not to be consumed by the threats to our congregation, but as we have strength, to take some knocks for them. That is what someone does, not who's in it for the money or the respect. That's what a shepherd does. But before I get to the shepherd, there is one more villain that demands our attention. And it is the one, I'm afraid, that we might be most easily deceived to become. And that villain is the thief. But to understand this character, we need to recall the narrative context of John 10. It has been demonstrated that the Gospel of John has several recognizable features of a Greek drama. The evangelist narrates the life of Jesus as a series of scenes, sometimes with dialogue, sometimes, as in John 10, a bit more of a monologue. If we go back to the previous scene in John 9, the evangelizing dramatist recounts Jesus healing on the Sabbath, and in this instance, it's the healing of the man born blind. And of course, this takes place on the Sabbath. And then the rest of John 9, as you know, John details those skirmishes between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. And the scene closes with this exchange, where Jesus says, "I entered the world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind." Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, "Are you saying we are blind? If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty," Jesus replied. "But you remain guilty because you claim to see that you can see." It is this statement against self-sufficiency, against the idea that we do not need the Lord to reveal our blindness and then heal it. This is what launches Jesus into the monologue of the Good Shepherd in John 10. So if we pay attention not only to the characters, but also to Jesus's ordering of them, we notice that he does not start this monologue with the good, but with the bad. He starts with a villain. The first activity he describes is that of thieves and bandits, those people who take what is not theirs, even take through violence. Notice their similarity to the wolf. Given what they do to the sheep, it's not surprising that such transgressors would not follow the rules for entry. They don't walk through the appropriate sheep gate, Jesus says, but they hop over the side. His initial teaching on shepherding portrays a picture in which thieving people reject the given and correct pathway and instead make their own, with the goal of removing the sheep from their place of safety to possess those sheep for themselves. In verse 5, Jesus reveals that this doesn't work out so well for the thief, doesn't work out the way that the thief intended. Instead, the thief is met with frustration. The sheep do not follow the thief. They run away. We can imagine maybe a blooper reel of a curly mustache-clad thief who hops over the fence intending for the sheep to run to him and follow him, but instead is met with a pack of frightened animals skittering about. And as he runs around trying to catch him, he frequently falls on his face. Can you see it? It would be funny if it wasn't pointing to something true. The narrative context of John 10 reveals that Jesus is telling this parable to the Pharisees. They've just had an entire chapter, and it's a long one, over 40 verses, an entire chapter worth of frustration. They wanted the man born blind to follow them. They wanted him to be angry at Jesus for healing him on the wrong day. They wanted him to call Jesus a sinner. They try repeatedly to get that man to follow him, and he continues to run away from them, disagreeing with their assessment of Jesus. "This guy healed me. He must be a prophet," the man says. And then he gets cheeky about it. "I don't know whether or not he's a sinner. One thing I know, I was blind and now I see." And then when they press him, he really turns on the heat. "I've told you already and you wouldn't listen. You want to hear the story again? Do you want to become his disciples?" This is good stuff. It would be a great play. It sounds like a group of thieves pathetically chasing after a sheep who continually eludes their grasp. The sobering thing about the dialogue of skirmish in chapter 9 and this parable that reflects upon it in chapter 10 is that I seriously doubt the Pharisees saw themselves as thieves. In fact, I believe that they believed they were doing the right thing. "It isn't about us," they would say. "We don't want the blind man to follow us. We only want him to follow Moses." They say, "You are Jesus' disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken through Moses, but as for this man Jesus, we don't know where he comes from." "Look," they're saying to the man no longer blind, "we just want you to follow the right way." But of course, any way that is not with Jesus can never be anything but wrong. The thief, Jesus says in John 10:10, comes with one purpose and one purpose only, to steal, kill, and destroy. And this is terrifying. I do not believe this is what the Pharisees intended, but this is how it would have ended up. The sheep, the blind man, had he followed the Pharisees and not Jesus, would have ended up spiritually dead, in exactly the same condition as if he had had a run-in with the wolf. None of us here intend to be thieves, but I worry if we might be tempted at times to end up as robbers. If we find ourselves caring deeply that our congregation follow our way, our politics, our doctrines, our preferences, might we imagine that we are getting them to follow what is right, align themselves with our Moses, but really in ways we've not fully interrogated, it's about seizing them into our ideology that has superseded Jesus and therefore, being misaligned, has departed from him. Jesus says that all those who came before him were thieves and robbers. And initially that might sound a bit supersessionist, as if all the prophets who preceded Jesus were evil. But that does not align with the whole of the scriptures. Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets rather than replacing them. But thinking about the thieves who want the sheep to follow their ideology, this makes good sense of what Jesus says about all those who come before him. What if he's not referring to time, but to position? The thief, by promoting his or her way, this ideology tries to get in front of Jesus. Listen to me rather than him. Now, to be clear, there is a right and a wrong. If a congregant isn't embracing classic Christian doctrine, they need to be shepherded into it. But do they have to agree with our hermeneutic of baptism or the Lord's Supper? Probably not. But no one's really fighting about such things any longer. That's too easy of an example. Let's take something harder. There's also a right and wrong in our political life. And I have appreciated deeply the ways that Todd and Gerald and Joel have taken public stands in the last several years. There are some things that we must say are wrong. Hatred of enemies is never okay. But as we live in the heat of this moment, even when we are willing to die on a particular hill, that conviction must be offered in relationship, as the leaders of CPT have done. I will not call this political movement good. But if you see it differently, let's keep talking, because most of all, I want you to be with Jesus. But that example is complicated and not the focus of our time together this week. So allow me to share another more personally pastoral example. I feel the thieving nature rise within myself when I read student exams. I didn't think that would be funny. Particularly on the unit on Paul. For this is where I tackle all the hot-button issues of slavery, sexuality, and the subject which is integral to my own vocation, the relationship of men and women in the church. On the day I give that lecture, I put myself on the line, my exegetical arguments, my personal experience that gets my heart beating and never fails to make me gutturally emotional. And then there are times where brave students, and I feel it most acutely with the women, who in their essay share with me that they have not chosen to buy what I'm offering. I disagree with your position, Dr. Peeler, for these reasons, and I admire them. I learn from them. But I will be honest with you, it grieves me. That one got away. My emotional reaction discloses to me that though I say at the beginning of the semester and frequently thereafter, I am not here to win you over to my position, I'm only here to make you love God's word and more adept at studying it. And though I believe this and strive to live it, there is still an aspect of myself that really wants them to join my team. Now, I believe that my position is in alignment with Jesus. We can talk about that later. But even so, in these moments, I sense a misalignment in myself. I have some more work to do to ensure that I don't become a thief. The thief is out of step with Jesus in at least two respects: the entry and the call. The way they enter the pen and how they try to get the sheep to come to them. The thief has to thieve the sheep because they will not follow the thief willingly. Were they able to exercise their own free agency, they would not go with the thief, and so the villain has to employ force. But in order to see this dissonance well, it is finally time to turn to the chief good shepherd, Jesus himself. Jesus begins this teaching with the thief, but then quickly turns to the shepherd, and the first contrast is their point of entry. Whereas the thief, who is not welcome, has to hop over the fence, it is not so with the shepherd. The shepherd comes in the proper gate. The shepherd has no need to circumvent the correct entry because the gatekeeper trusts the shepherd, trusts him enough to open the gate. The shepherd is welcome because the sheep belong to him, and the shepherd checks on them frequently enough to be recognized by the porter. The second distinction is that of their calls to the sheep. When the shepherd walks in the gate, the shepherd calls out. We know this because Jesus said that the sheep listen to the voice of the shepherd. Maybe they hear him shout an initial hello, but the shepherd does more than offer this general greeting. Then, Jesus said, the shepherd calls his own sheep by name. Might you consider a moment when you were called by name? I imagine we can all connect with those rather awful moments when we're fighting to stay awake in a lecture. I hope not right now. You want to be respectful, you're interested in the content, but the eyelids are weightier than the willpower. If in those painfully drowsy moments the teacher happens to call you out by name, you are instantly revived, immediately brought to attention through direct address. If the sheep were distracted, when they hear their name, they fully give their attention to the shepherd. It is because of this form of address, this familiarity born out of frequent, precise attention, that the sheep are happy to follow the shepherd. But it takes a bit of effort on the part of the shepherd. As Jesus describes it, the shepherd does not simply call the sheep by name, the shepherd does more. But the shepherd's effort is not like the thief who has to run around and chase them down. But there is some effort nonetheless. In verse 4, Jesus describes two movements of the shepherd. The shepherd prods out and goes before. I imagine that sheep, like people, are creatures of incredible inertia. If they are bodies at rest, they desire to remain at rest. And so, at times, the shepherd has to get them moving, pushes them just a bit so that they can experience the plenty of pasture. But then, once they are moving, the shepherd changes position from behind them to before them. The shepherd walks out of the pen, providing the sheep the example to follow, the example of what to do. I find it powerful. It was rather striking to me to notice that the shepherd does not face them, telling them what to do, but turns away from the sheep, walks out, showing them what to do. The shepherd trusts the relationship he has built enough to turn his back and walk out, assured that they will follow. And the shepherd, in walking away, is not like the hired worker who abandons the sheep, but instead walks out to lead the sheep. The shepherd is not departing from the sheep, but remains tethered to them. How? By the sound of his voice. They follow him, Jesus says, not because they can see his face, but because they know his voice. They've heard it often and personally, and they aren't just listening to it, they know it. And this is why the sheep don't follow the thief, for they don't know that voice. That voice is more concerned to build up itself than to care for the sheep. It has no connection for them, and so they run away from it. Both the thief and the shepherd enter the pen with the same goal, namely to remove the sheep. Isn't that interesting? They both want to get the sheep out. But the entry, the method, and the intent could not be any more opposed. Entry, the thief jumps over the side, but the shepherd is welcomed at the appropriate gate. Method, the thief wrangles, often unsuccessfully, but the shepherd calls out the sheep by name. Intent, the thief is trying to selfishly steal, but the shepherd leads them out with his well-known voice so that they can enjoy the blessings of the pasture. But there's more. Jesus is not yet done describing himself. Now, I do believe he intends for the listeners to see him as the shepherd. But then, as you know, in verse 7, he says explicitly, I am the gate, the door for the sheep. I'm sure that you've heard that shepherds can use their own bodies to function as the sheep gate, an opening left in a stone pen at which they lay down to keep the sheep in and the predators out. If you read commentators on John 10, you know that no ancient text has discussed this practice, but yet it is known in rural life. And I believe it is the right image for this text. For Jesus goes on to say twice over, I lay down my life for the sheep. He is the shepherd, and he is the gate. And this further discloses what is disordered about the thief. The thief does not go through the doorway, does not access the sheep through and with the permission of Jesus, but goes his or her own way. Unless one comes through the shepherd who is the gate, then one's presence among the sheep is only for thieving, will only result in destruction. Jesus' dual image, the shepherd who is the gate, also begins to reveal with clarity the ways in which we as ministers are like him, the shepherd, and the ways in which we cannot be. As I said earlier, no one would expect the hired workers to sacrifice themselves for the sheep. Defend the sheep and dispose of the wolf, yes, but not die a sacrificial death. But this is exactly what Jesus, as the gate shepherd, does. When he speaks of laying down his life, he is speaking of the ultimate and complete gift, all the way to death itself, even death on the cross. No other shepherd need make the sacrifice. First, because we cannot. Only he can do so, since he is the God-man, both the source of life and the one who can experience death and conquer it. But second, no other shepherd need make this sacrifice because Jesus has already done so. We need not repeat it. This is the reason why pastors need to be willing to take some bruises, but not obliterate ourselves for the sake of ministry. This is not first and foremost a lesson learned from the beneficial psychology of self-care. No, the reason to reject self-immolation is at base Christological. We don't die for our congregations because Jesus has already done so. We do take up our crosses, give ourselves fully and sacrificially to God, but we don't die on behalf of others. We are not the ultimate shepherd. We are not the gate. He is. Notice the movement. After Jesus insinuates that he is the shepherd in the first paragraph, and then claims to be the door, only then does he say explicitly, I am the good shepherd. And I don't think he is simply saying he's nice. This is an adjective of infinite qualitative distinction. Yes, it pertains to scope. Jesus has all of the sheep, and we are given just a small pen. But even more fundamentally, we may be called to be shepherds, but only he is truly good. Good in the sense that he is the holy God who sacrifices himself for us. For, as Jesus says, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. If we are to be faithful shepherds, we need first to acknowledge his status as the chief and ultimate shepherd. And the way to do so is to remember that though we may be called to shepherd, we are first and foremost sheep. And this was said at our opening worship, our first day. To be a faithful shepherd, we need to live into our identity as sheep. This is not, I think, something that demands of us vigorous work. And that might be quite good news if you are a pastor who finds yourself weary. But being a sheep is largely a receptive act. The sheep do listen to his voice, but he's the one who calls out first and calls directly by name. It's the shepherd who does the work to get our attention. And the sheep must follow the shepherd out of the pen, but he does prod them and set an example for them. The sheep could, I guess, ignore the voice of the shepherd or let distractions muddle that voice. The sheep could resist the movement of the shepherd and the movement of the flock, but that seems like it would take much more effort than receiving what the shepherd is so readily providing. Maybe the first lesson from the sheep is simply cease striving. Be quiet enough to hear and trusting enough to follow. And although this is a receptive action, I do wonder if many of us, like myself, struggle with the idea of receiving God's individualized care. I have lived in communities of Christians that have rightly moved from individualism to recognize and celebrate the communal nature of our faith. That is good and is of chief importance. But sometimes I wonder if I've lost sight of that individualized divine care. But the shepherd wanted to care for the sheep, yes, and that includes each of us by name. A moment ago, I asked you to consider how it feels when an authority figure calls out your name, how it can revive you. Allow me to alter that image slightly. Consider someone you deeply value, out of respect or love. Recall those moments when that mentor or friend or love interest called you by name. When they said it, it felt like lightning. I hope you have also had those moments, maybe audibly or maybe a deep spiritual sense that God got your attention by saying your name, to protect you, to redeem you, to encourage you, to challenge you. What an act of intimate, attentive love. This is the practice of the Good Shepherd. So to accept it may not be rigorous work, but that does not mean that it comes easy. Jesus goes on to say that as the Good Shepherd, he knows his own. And that means that the sheep have to be vulnerable enough, trusting enough to accept being known. It would be easier to put up a facade. It'd be harder to accept that God sees us fully, our ugliness and our victories. As Jesus describes himself as the door, he says that anyone who comes to him will be saved. And this aligns with other statements that he is the one way to the Father. Something powerful about this image is that it is not static. He goes on to say that there is movement in and out, moments of retreat and moments of exploration. Yes, it is the initiative of the shepherd, but then we are given the muscles to respond, to go out and find that pasture that God has provided. I began with this image, that maybe shepherding is a picture of domination, infantilization, an image that assumes that we as clergy know more and live better than our congregants, who without our help would be vulnerable and aimless. That is not correct. Instead, I have learned from this passage that pastors as shepherds establish relationship with the sheep to facilitate their relationship with God, provide encouragement and challenge, set a good example so that sheep can do what God created sheep to do, move about freely and enjoy the abundant provisions God makes available. The sheep are not wholly dependent on us. We are only called to facilitate space and relationship to allow them to flourish as God intended them to be. Nevertheless, it must be acknowledged that there is authority in this role. As Jesus says near the end, I have authority, but his authority is manifest in the laying down of his life. So too for us as shepherds. Authority is necessary, not to destroy ourselves, but as I've said, to take the bruises of the wolves, to stand up for the sheep. Mark well, leaders who only ever lead from below, leaders who only ever serve, leave the lambs for the slaughter if a threat comes. A shepherd also has to protect. But we, as the under-shepherds, never do so in an ultimate way, sacrificing ourselves fully, either to our own destruction or the building up of a martyr-like pride. Jesus is the only one who lays down his life in full. And so whatever self-sacrificial authority we exert is always in deference to his. And Jesus doesn't stay laying down. It is also the Father's command that he exert his authority to take up his life again. Jesus is the kind of shepherd who gives himself fully to the wolf for the sake of the sheep, and in so doing destroys the wolf and returns to reign in glory. And this is another Christological reason why pastors are not asked to fully sacrifice ourselves for our congregation. Yes, because Jesus has already done so in full, but also because we are baptized into his death and resurrection. We are asked to depend upon the renewal of the Spirit to take up our lives again. If we experience some bruises, it's not wrong to retreat into the pen for a while to be healed and made whole again, so that we can come out again in victory, ready to receive the blessings God has planned. In addition to an authority that lays down and stands up, the parable of the Good Shepherd reveals that the pastor as shepherd does not stand in front of the congregation with a wagging finger, but goes behind to gently prod and then moves in front to focus on following Jesus so that our sheep will follow us. I've been working in the pastoral epistles recently and have noticed a distinct term for Christian leadership, the leader's proistemi. The various translated as direct or lead or woodenly they stand before. And I had gotten in my head the picture of a teacher at a lectern, not unlike this moment. And maybe that is right. But the shepherding image has opened up a new possibility for me. What if the posture is not facing the congregation always, but facing Jesus, standing before the sheep as a shepherd, but chiefly as a fellow sheep? That is a kind of image of shepherding that I could get behind. I'm not a wolf. I hope I'm not a hired worker, and I'm learning not to be a thief. I'm a sheep blessedly called by name, and also graciously called to shepherd. Might we do so, not trying to be just like Jesus, because we can't and shouldn't, but to shepherd as we are shepherded by the only one who is fully and truly good.
Her presentation, when we were selecting the topic for this conference and like how to communicate the theme, and Good Shepherds obviously comes out of John chapter 10. And I love the way you've directed our attention to this passage. I was struck just listening to you, just how beautiful of an image it is and how rich it is, and really appreciate the ways you drew our attention to so many of the dynamics and different characters. I think there are so many things we could talk about. One place maybe to start, you throughout the talk came back to it at the end, this tension between kind of shepherding as top-down, and you stated your preference for kind of a bit more of like a service bottom-up. Dispositionally, it seems kind of you're wired in that direction. And I think there are others in the room who will feel that. So I'd like to ask you about that. If you know, you're a pastor in this room and you resonate by temperament, perhaps with one of those. You're drawn to the call of pastoral ministry, or you're energized by a bit more authoritative top-down dynamics of the office, or perhaps you're temperamentally drawn and animated by, and your heart is really drawn into those kind of bottom-up service elements. I really appreciate what you said at the end about if you're only doing the bottom-up thing, that's not good for the sheep. But of course, the opposite is also true.
Right.
So I'd love you to reflect on how we can think about our wiring and our temperaments and kind of filling in the other side, perhaps, to be effective shepherds in this model that you're talking about.
Yeah, what a wonderful question. So I can think of two answers there. One, that none of us should feel guilty wherever kind of our temperament is. I appreciate Todd's study of the Enneagram, right? Like if you're a 3 or an 8, you're going to lead very differently, and that's a beautiful thing. That's part of our created nature. So my first answer would be nature and grace. Consider yourself, how has God wired me? Do I enjoy taking leadership, or am I more from the bottom? That's a beautiful and good thing. And then Spirit, where do I need you to help fill in the parts that are harder for me? So that's one answer. I think that's so through Scripture, affirming the image of God in us in particularity, and then inviting the Spirit to fill out those places that are weaknesses for us. But then, second, of course, it demands that, it is good if we have then a team of people. And I recognize there are some parishes, some churches who cannot afford to have more than one pastor. It's understandable, but hopefully then you have a support network. But ideally, you have multiple people who have different dynamics so that you balance each other out in this practice of ministry. So both individual and communal.
Yeah, and I invite you to come forward. Excuse me. Like I said, we have time for a couple questions. We got a couple people showing up, so maybe instead of me doing another, we can jump right over here.
Dr. Peeler, thank you for your talk. Just about 2/3 of the way through your talk, you had this slide that was about how you started your talk.
Yes.
And one of the bullet points was viewing the sheep as though they'll be led astray without me. And then your following slide and then it talk about facilitating their walk with God and getting to know them. But I didn't feel like there was a corresponding point about defending the sheep against like false teaching. What came to my mind was like Paul in 2 Timothy 3:6. Talks about the false teachers going house to house. And I actually just read it while I was waiting, and I felt like the passage both agreed and disagreed, because he says the weak will be captured, but that the foolishness of these false teachers will be made plain. So at a time like this, where especially not just the last 8 years, but the last like month of political craziness, all of a sudden people in our congregation, surprised, they now follow some for God knows how long, they've been listening to some teacher online, or the theology, whether we call it that or not, that comes out of the White House, and it does feel like our congregants are slipping away faster than they ever have before with the digital age. So why don't you view the sheep as though they will be led astray? If like there's some calling that I have to be running around like more like a sheepdog instead of a shepherd, making sure they don't get out of the path, because they're all trying to get out at the same time. So.
That's a fantastic point. Allow me to clarify, and this could have been more.
I also didn't think that would be funny as I said it.
It's surprising, isn't it?
No, that's great. Yeah.
The point I was going for in there is that sheep, by their very nature, want to go out to pasture. So that's the small point of like, if we let the sheep do what they are created to do, if we create the space for it, they're going to tap into their image of God and find good. Now, when we get to the wolves and the thieves, absolutely, that's the place where we do need to exert those boundaries. And that's what I was saying very briefly, that if there is a retreat from true Christian doctrine, and I do believe we see that right now, that it is absolutely on us to be as clear as possible. And that's why this moment is so hard, as has been named in several of the talks already. Everyone thinks they're on the right side. And this is, again, why we need community of people, of fellow pastors, maybe pastors who have different backgrounds, different communities, as we heard from Eddie last night, right? That will check our own proclivities and biases. But there does come a time, it seems to me, and if you see it differently, let's chat, where we've got to say wrong is wrong. It feels like we are in that moment. But we need a good community to help us discern that. Our grandchildren will know if we've done this right or not. We don't have that privilege right now, and so we must, in community, be dependent on the Spirit. But yes, we have to say some things are wrong.
Okay, thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. A really, really strong, beautiful point, challenging the idea. I think you used the term at the end of prideful martyrdom, and the difference between the scars that a shepherd would take on. And I was thinking about that term. I'm just wondering if we can tease out just a little further the idea of martyrdom, because I think it's a really important caution of that sort of false martyrdom. And at the same time, I was thinking, and yet there are martyrs.
Yes,
and I was thinking about, Mark 8, whoever tries to save his life will lose it, and whoever lays down his life. So I just wonder if you could tease out a little further for shepherds, under shepherds, and for the people of God. What does it look like to lay down our lives? Not as Jesus did once for all.
Right.
But how would you tease that out just one step further, I'm wondering?
That's so helpful, Steve. So I'm thinking in two different directions here. So absolutely, we give ourselves fully, sacrificially to God, that taking of a cross. That is where martyrdom is right. We offer our whole selves on that altar and then find ourselves, right? But there seems to be a distinction if we think we need to sacrifice ourselves for others. So I'm affirming the vertical and rejecting the horizontal. Yeah. But how that plays out in any particular situation is often, as I said to this question, hard to discern. But I do think if there's this mindset, and I feel like it's been said in several of the other talks that we take on that savior motif, right? It's like, or even this kind of prideful sense of, wow, look what an awesome pastor I am because my life is trash because I just give everything for them, right? Like this tension of, yes, you give, but no pastor is only ever called to serve the congregation. Pastors also need to care for their own bodies. They have friends, they have families. You've got to leave some bandwidth for the other calls that you have in your life. That's what I'm nervous about. And in a crisis situation, sometimes it does feel like you're giving everything for this moment. And that's where, again, you need a community and maybe those times for retreat and healing. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful presentation. I see some connections between your talk and Dr. Sonderger's last night.
I always hope that's true.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I'm a young youth pastor, and all of my volunteer leaders are a decade or decades older than I am.
Wow.
So do you have some thoughts on, you touched a little bit on this at the beginning of your talk, discipling, the call to humbly disciple with the virtues of last night, those who are older than you when you are younger.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. I hoped someone would raise it. And I think this is why Paul spends a lot of time writing to Timothy. Let no one look down upon your youth, because that's easy to do for yourself and for others to do. I also recall who are the examples that Jesus lifts up for us? Children. These are the ones that show us the way of the kingdom. So might we return to the parrhesia that we heard of last night, this boldness, this settledness that not a pride, but by virtue of what God has done in me and for me, I know who I am. Unsurprisingly, I find this chiefly in the Virgin Mary in the Magnificat. She is a 14-year-old oppressed Jewish poor girl, and yet she can say, all generations will call me blessed, not out of pride, because of what God has invited her to do. She is my muse in this, of a young and humble confidence, and I believe we're all called to pattern off of that, no matter our age. But it is a lot tougher. And there's also something to be said. Matt O'Reilly said this in a meeting last night. There's something to be said. As you live a little bit of life, you have kind of the school of hard knocks wisdom. And so even to say to your youth leaders, I don't have that yet. And yet God has called me to this role, that you might work out that sense of, I don't know if I would have been able to press into it early on. I had to do some learning, but maybe you can press into that sense of shepherding even those who are beyond you in age.
I often say something in my sermons that you said in your talk. It is not Christian to hate. And yet, when I say it, Psalm 139 goes through my head. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord? And I want to get that out of my head so I can keep saying, stop hating people. Is there an answer for me?
You know who I think of is Paul in the different ways he reacts with the Corinthians and the Galatians, probably because I was teaching it last week. But the Corinthians couldn't have more problems than they do. And yet he can be nice to them in the beginning of the letter, but not so with the Galatians. Right? He has such harsh words for the disturbers, the Judaizers, things that I wouldn't want to say. We all know what line I'm speaking of. But Paul's vitriol is not against them at human beings, but their false gospel. This is what he hates. In Galatians, it is Jesus plus anything equals salvation, which may be not unlike our own time. Jesus plus Christian nationalism, whatever it might be. So you can hate the false gospel and yet aim to prayerfully advocate and pray for the restoration of the humans who are advocating that false gospel as image bearers who could and long to be restored. I don't know if that helps.
I'll offer another question. I think I was really struck and challenged when you were telling the story about reading students' papers.
Yeah.
And you used that line of when a student doesn't align with what you taught. And there's different dynamics in church contexts, you know.
That's true. That's
so
true.
That's one thing I want to name. But I felt that moment where you said, one got away. And that kind of like thief dynamic that you named there. And I think that's so helpful for us to reflect on. But it also raised for me, we've hinted at this a little bit in the conversation already, surely there are moments in pastoral ministry where we're thinking one got away, and it's not from us.
No, that's right. Right.
It is that there are all these, you know, there's creedal orthodoxy, there's denominational distinctives that we as pastors, part of our office is commending those and to a certain degree perhaps calling congregants into alignment with them as part of the community of worshipers that we have together. And then there's other things that can become, I think you're drawing our attention to, about us. So just for a minute here at the end, reflect on the kind of theological triage necessary there. You know, one got away, is that got away from Jesus, the head shepherd, or got away from me and what I would like them to believe about secondary or tertiary theological, political question, whatever it may be.
Do you think fruit works there? I think fruit almost always works.
Okay.
In the sense of if someone is truly departing from their relationship with the Lord, eventually they will wither or there will be bad fruit. And so that, I think the theological triage, sometimes it's immediate, right? If there is a kind of deconstruction in which they are rejecting the sovereignty of God, the divinity of Christ, that's immediately clear, right? But if it is in a category that you're not quite sure, there might be a need to exercise patience to discern, like, if they continue going in this pathway, are they still bearing what is clearly the fruit of the Spirit? If so, maybe they're just departing from something that I care deeply about, but that it is not, in my articulation, creed. But then if they are departing in such a way that their lives start to disintegrate, right, that Christ is no longer holding them and bearing fruit within them, then it's time to intervene with that sense of care.
Let's thank Amy one more time.